At that moment, the guards burst in and engaged in combat with the assassin. David King continued to feign madness, curling up on the bed and mumbling incoherently. Eleanor Bennet, struck in her right shoulder, collapsed unconscious. The guards rushed to the Imperial Medical Institute as the assassin found himself cornered. He had underestimated Eleanor Bennet, and his fate was self-inflicted. Laughing loudly, the assassin took his own life with his sword. Eleanor Bennet was brought to the Imperial Medical Institute for treatment. Experienced imperial physicians were summoned in a state of panic, as if sitting on pins and needles. Coincidentally, Dr. Moore was away from the palace at the time. Edward King, upon hearing the news, hurried over, only to witness the chaotic aftermath. A guard quickly stepped forward to report the incident. After hearing the account, Edward King grew deeply worried and hastened to Eleanor Bennet's quarters. "Your Highness, King Edward." The imperial physicians, upon seeing Edward King's anxious arrival, fearfully knelt to pay their respects. Edward King, deeply concerned for Eleanor Bennet, ignored them and strode directly into the room. Eleanor Bennet lay unconscious on the bed, her face pale, her chest covered in blood. "Eleanor Bennet!" Edward King softly called out, but there was no response. Ever since she took on David King's matters, danger had constantly loomed over her. "All of you, get in here now!" Edward King, his expression dark, shouted loudly. The imperial physicians timidly entered the room. "If you cannot save Eleanor Bennet, prepare to be buried alongside her." Edward King's command was severe, though his tone betrayed his anguish. "Your Highness, please calm down. We will do our utmost. However, our skills are limited, and it is imperative to summon Dr. Moore back to the palace immediately." The imperial physicians pleaded in fear. From the last time Edward King had protected Eleanor Bennet, they understood she was someone he deeply cared for. Now, it was even more evident. "Send someone to find Mr. Moore immediately. Until Dr. Moore returns, you must keep Eleanor Bennet alive. If not, prepare for death." Edward King's voice grew colder, his usual gentle demeanor utterly gone. "We obey. Your Highness, please step aside so we may stop Lord Bennet's bleeding." The imperial physicians trembled as they began their work. Edward King, gazing at Eleanor Bennet's faint breaths, reluctantly left the room. In the span of a tea break, Daniel Moore arrived in haste. His anxiety was palpable. He had only been away briefly, and yet Eleanor Bennet had encountered such a grave incident. Seeing Edward King standing in the courtyard, Daniel Moore didn't even pause to pay respects and rushed straight into Eleanor Bennet's room. Edward King, noticing his arrival, felt slightly more at ease. He placed his hopes on the disciple of the famed miracle doctor to save Eleanor Bennet. At this moment, James King also hurried over, seemingly with urgent news to report, forcing Edward King to unwillingly leave the Imperial Medical Institute. Meanwhile, in the Hall of Morning Flowers, the atmosphere remained cold and somber. Charles King sat on the bed, sleepless throughout the night. He had grasped every detail of the night's events. Hearing Blood Shadow's report, he couldn't help but feel a growing unease. "How is she now?" Charles King couldn't contain his worry for Eleanor Bennet. "Mr. Moore is trying to save her. Her fate is still uncertain," Blood Shadow replied, fully aware of who his master was asking about. "Has the assassin's identity been confirmed?" Charles King immediately crushed the ring in his hand, his expression as grim as the god of death. "It's the Seven Kills sect. The same sect that attempted to assassinate you before," Blood Shadow answered. Order all the shadow guards to eliminate every remnant of the 7 Kills sect within a month. Charles King felt it was time to teach the House of 7 Kills a lesson. Blood Shadow withdrew after receiving the command, noting that the prince seemed particularly unsettled tonight. As the cold mist dissipated, the entire majestic palace was bathed in the morning sunlight. A scene full of vitality overshadowed the dense fog of the night. Daniel Moore watched Eleanor Bennet sleeping soundly, as fragile as a newborn. Having crossed the line between life and death last night, he saw his feelings more clearly. Without her, his life would also fade away. Daniel Moore gazed absent-mindedly at the person on the bed, his heart in turmoil. "How is she?" Charles King appeared behind him without him noticing. Daniel Moore smirked coldly, realizing that his internal strength had improved to the point where even he couldn't sense him. "Haven't you seen for yourself?" Daniel Moore reproached him slightly. If not for him, she wouldn't be in this situation. "Brother, you've changed." Charles King sensed the resentment, wondering if their 10 years of brotherhood had to change because of Eleanor Bennet. "Charles, let her go. Your vendetta has nothing to do with her." Daniel Moore knew he couldn't change him, only hoping he wouldn't drag Eleanor Bennet into the abyss. "This lifetime, she can only belong to me. Whether she lives or dies is up to me." Charles King gently caressed Eleanor Bennet's snow-white cheek. Her appearance was a miracle. Daniel Moore left Eleanor Bennet's room, understanding Charles King too well. For what he desired, even if he couldn't have it, he wouldn't hesitate to destroy it. In his world, betrayal was not tolerated. Even as Charles King's elder brother, he was no exception. Eleanor Bennet's fate this lifetime was destined to be tragic. The only thing he could do was stay by her side and try to minimize the harm. He suddenly realized how powerless he truly was. Chapter 29, Potion Making. Eleanor Bennet awoke 3 days later. She opened her eyes, gazing at the familiar canopy, and sighed softly, a look of disappointment on her face. She had hoped to wake up in a pristine white hospital, which would mean she had completely left this dreadful place. "Just escaped death and already looking gloomy, you truly are one of a kind." Charles King sat leisurely on a chair not far away, enjoying his tea. "Why are you here?" Eleanor Bennet was surprised that the first person she saw upon waking was him. Had he been here all along? Since when did her life or death concern him so much? "Just wanted to see if you're still alive," Charles King said, holding on to the fireplace, wrapped in a thick fur coat. Eleanor Bennet looked out the window, where snow blanketed everything in white. No wonder he was dressed like a bear today. The thought made Eleanor Bennet chuckle. If he knew what she was thinking, he would surely strangle her. Charles King watched Eleanor Bennet sighing one moment and smiling the next, utterly perplexed. She truly was unique. After narrowly escaping death, she was first gloomy, then immediately cheerful. What on earth was going on in her mind? Eleanor Bennet felt her mouth dry and wanted to sit up to drink tea but was afraid of disturbing her wounds. She accidentally toppled towards the edge of the bed. Fortunately, a strong arm caught her just in time, moving so quickly that Eleanor Bennet was astonished. "Are you tired of living, woman?" Charles King frowned, but his tone revealed concern. "I'm thirsty." Eleanor Bennet couldn't be bothered to argue with him and just looked longingly at the distant teacup. Charles King gently laid her down and went to pour tea for Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor Bennet intended to drink it herself, but Charles King unexpectedly fed her directly. She looked at Charles King curiously today, her eyes filled with confusion. It was unusual for him to treat a mere pawn so well, especially since there was no need for such behavior between them. "Eleanor Bennet, you're awake." Daniel Moore was overjoyed to see Eleanor Bennet. But as soon as he saw Charles King, his expression darkened. When had he arrived? Recently, Eleanor Bennet's place had been quite lively. Edward King visited daily, while Charles King appeared when Daniel Moore was preparing medicine. The admiration in Edward King's eyes for Eleanor Bennet was evident, but Daniel Moore couldn't discern Charles King's feelings. What exactly did he feel for Eleanor Bennet? Perhaps even Charles King himself didn't understand. Daniel Moore glanced at Charles King with concern, feeling deeply uneasy. "Senior brother, I'm leaving now." Charles King glanced at Eleanor Bennet on the bed and then left the room. "Daniel." Eleanor Bennet smiled, temporarily ignoring Charles King's strange behavior today. "How are you feeling?" Daniel quickly stepped forward to check Eleanor Bennet's pulse. "Daniel, I'm fine. These wounds will heal with rest." Eleanor Bennet reassured him. Seeing his worry, "Eleanor Bennet, is that book really so important?" Daniel Moore couldn't understand why Eleanor Bennet insisted on getting involved in this troublesome matter. Was she doing it for David King? "Daniel, I really want to leave this place, but I can't ignore the Bennet family's welfare. This ledger might be the key to protecting the Bennet family at a critical moment." Eleanor Bennet expressed her thoughts. Daniel Moore didn't know what to say. He couldn't blame her for her actions, she truly had no other choice. "Daniel, have you retrieved the blood crow grass?" "Yes, I've got it." "Good. Help me find some rabbits and prepare a few more tools." "Eleanor Bennet, your body hasn't recovered yet. What do you intend to do?" Daniel Moore was surprised. Despite her severe injuries, she still wanted to act. "I want to concoct medicine. The one behind David King has run out of patience. Although this assassination attempt failed, there will surely be another. I must seize the time to execute my plan." Eleanor Bennet had a thorough plan. This assassination attempt only accelerated her progress, and she believed David King would soon have to yield. "Eleanor Bennet, no matter what, be careful." Daniel Moore was still worried about her injuries, but seeing her confident eyes, he could only support her silently. "Don't worry." Eleanor Bennet tightly held Daniel Moore's hand, sending a warm feeling through his heart. Eleanor Bennet rested for a few days before starting to concoct medicine. She first ground the blood crow herb into powder, testing it in different doses on white rabbits. Eleanor Bennet knew well that to achieve the desired effect, the dosage had to be precise, otherwise, David King would surely die from poisoning. But for an expert like her, this task was as easy as turning her hand. 3 days later, Eleanor Bennet successfully created the pill she had been hoping for. Carefully, she placed the pill into an exquisite porcelain bottle and smiled in satisfaction. She needed to meet David King once more. "Lady, your spirit is truly remarkable, injured yet still refusing to rest." Charles King's sudden appearance startled Eleanor Bennet, prompting her to hurriedly stash the porcelain bottle into her medicine chest. "Why are you here?" Eleanor Bennet asked while tidying up the messy tools on her table, trying to maintain her composure. Charles King noticed her tension, glanced at the cluttered table, but found nothing suspicious. "What are you doing?" Charles King questioned, his eyes filled with doubt as he approached her. "Making medicine." Eleanor Bennet replied nervously, lowering her head to avoid his gaze. Charles King casually picked up a tool, intending to sniff it, but Eleanor Bennet quickly snatched it back. "Don't touch my things, you might get poisoned," Eleanor Bennet said as she moved the tool into the inner room. "You're making poison?" Charles King, who had assumed she was preparing medicine for injuries, was surprised to find out she might also know how to make poison. "If I truly knew how to make poison, the first person I'd poison would be you," Eleanor Bennet denied immediately, not wanting things to escalate. "You truly hate me that much?" Charles King sat down casually, his charming eyes still radiating his undeniable handsomeness. "Of course. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have to suffer like this." Eleanor Bennet's face turned slightly red, her words tinged with resentment. "Eleanor Bennet, stop putting on an act in front of me. You shielded David King from that blade, there must be another motive behind it, right?" Eleanor Bennet fell silent, surprised at how sharp this nine-tailed fox truly was. He seemed to have sensed something. Even if there were a motive, it's useless. David King has indeed gone mad. "What do you mean by that?" Charles King hadn't expected her to admit it so openly. "That night, I observed David King. He had no idea how to evade the assassin's blade. If it wasn't sheer stupidity, then there's no other reason for him to willingly court death." Eleanor Bennet decided to fabricate a lie to dispel Charles King's suspicions. After hearing her, Charles King remained silent for a long time, making Eleanor Bennet increasingly uneasy. She wasn't sure if this small lie could deceive him. "Remember, Eleanor Bennet, don't play petty games. The lives of the entire Lowe family are in your hands. Since David King is no longer of any use, there's no need for you to remain at the Imperial Medical Institute." Watching Charles King's arrogant figure as he left, the tension in Eleanor Bennet's heart finally eased. Eleanor Bennet understood that Charles King had believed her lie. But for now, the most important thing was negotiating with David King. Otherwise, if he were sent back to the celestial prison again, there would be no more chances left. Eleanor Bennet carefully donned her cloak, took the poison she had prepared, and headed to David King's courtyard. The snow in the yard had melted, and the air carried a slight chill. Eleanor Bennet gently stroked her injured right arm, the horrifying scene from that night still vivid in her mind. "Lord Lowe, why are you here?" The guard outside the courtyard was astonished by her appearance at this hour. "The Grand Prince Simong will soon be sent back to the celestial prison. I'm here to perform the final treatment." Eleanor Bennet knew that Charles King would soon obtain the imperial decree, so her words weren't entirely false. The guards didn't suspect a thing and allowed Eleanor Bennet to enter. After all, this woman was no ordinary person. Just recalling King Edward's concern for her that night, they were certain she would hold the power over their master's fate in the future. Thus, they dared not offend her. Chapter 30, The Golden Cicada Shedding Its Shell. 1. David King looked at Eleanor Bennet, a hint of surprise flashing in his eyes. She had appeared again. Remembering how she had risked her life to shield him from a blade that night, he couldn't help but see her in a new light. Not only her intentions but even her aura made men wary. How could a woman like her willingly be a pawn of the nine-tailed fox? The Grand Prince is truly ungrateful. I risked my life to save you, yet there hasn't been a single word of thanks. Eleanor Bennet sneered coldly, seating herself without permission. Lord Bennet, your selfless act is etched in my heart. David King chuckled, his eyes gleaming with cunning. Unfortunately, I can only save your highness once. Eleanor Bennet looked at David King with a regretful expression. What do you mean by that? David King pressed for an answer. I've reported to His Majesty that the Grand Prince's madness is incurable. I'm afraid it won't be long before you're sent back to the celestial prison. Eleanor Bennet spoke nonchalantly, as if the matter had nothing to do with her. Eleanor Bennet, you, David King was so enraged he wanted to strangle her, but he quickly regained his composure. Tell me your plan. David King knew that if he returned to the celestial prison, even if he wasn't assassinated, Alexander King would hold him accountable. He had no way out now. This medicine is specially prepared for your highness. Once consumed, it will make you appear truly dead. Once the news of your death spreads, the danger will naturally dissipate. 3 days later, the effects will wear off, and your highness will come back to life. Eleanor Bennet took out a delicate porcelain bottle and placed it in front of David King. How can I trust you? David King's face showed suspicion. If this was a trick, wouldn't it be a loss beyond recovery? Your highness may not believe it, but this is your only chance. Eleanor Bennet stood up, preparing to leave. All right, then what are the conditions? David King put away the porcelain bottle, deciding to take a gamble. I only need your records. Eleanor Bennet turned to look at the fallen David King. He was now like an arrow already drawn on the bowstring, with no way to retreat. I will make a deal with you. If it could truly save a life, how could he refuse? The prince only needs to quietly bring this medicine back to the prison and take it after a few days. I will arrange everything properly to assist your highness. After giving her instructions, Eleanor Bennet left the room. As she walked, Eleanor Bennet pondered. The plan was set, now, it was only a matter of waiting for the imperial decree to convict David King. She believed David King would not disappoint her. Looking into the distance, Eleanor Bennet saw a few sparrows startled into flight, causing some unmelted snowflakes to fall, sparkling beautifully in the air. Eleanor Bennet, so here you are. I've been looking for you everywhere. Edward King had intended to visit Eleanor Bennet in her room, but she was nowhere to be found. Unexpectedly, he saw her standing absent-mindedly in the courtyard. Your Highness King Edward, I greet you. Eleanor Bennet quickly bowed in respect. Eleanor Bennet, you are injured, there's no need for formalities. Edward King stepped forward to help Eleanor Bennet, gazing at her with deep affection. Thank you for your concern, Your Highness. Eleanor Bennet lowered her head, avoiding his gaze. Eleanor Bennet, I will not let you face danger again. I have already petitioned my father to send David King back to the prison. If he is beyond saving, he must still be dealt with according to the law. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel suspicious. She had assumed Charles King would be the one to report this matter, why was it Edward King instead? Could it be that the two brothers shared the same thoughts? Eleanor Bennet absolutely did not believe this was a coincidence. She suspected it was a deliberate arrangement by the cunning Charles King. Could it be that even by Edward King's side, Charles King had planted his trusted aides? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but admire Charles King's meticulousness and thoroughness. Such a man was truly terrifying. Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness King Edward. Eleanor Bennet bowed in gratitude. After all, her goal had been achieved. As for the struggle for the throne between the two brothers, she had no interest in it. Eleanor Bennet, I have sent someone to bring you a ginseng root to help with your recovery. You are still gravely injured, so please refrain from moving around unnecessarily. Edward King held Eleanor Bennet's soft hand, determined not to let go no matter what. "Thank you, Your Highness." Faced with Edward King's deep affection, Eleanor Bennet felt a bit flustered. She had no such intentions, yet he seemed unwilling to give up. Confronted with this complicated affection, Eleanor Bennet truly did not know how to handle it. "Eleanor Bennet, it's time to take your medicine." Daniel Moore stood at a distance holding the medicine, but upon seeing Edward King, he suddenly became flustered. "Oh!" Daniel Moore's appearance brought Eleanor Bennet a great sense of relief. "Your Grace, I shall take my leave now." Eleanor Bennet took a deep breath of the cold air, and the pressure in her heart instantly dissipated. She smiled at Daniel Moore before returning to her room. Edward King watched the graceful figure walking away. That charming smile naturally caught his eye, stirring jealousy in his heart. Could it be that the one she cared about was him? "Eleanor Bennet, I truly cannot bear to destroy you, but I can destroy the one you love. One day, you will realize my feelings." Edward King stormed off in anger, planting the seeds of future hatred. Chapter 31, The Golden Cicada Sheds Its Shell. 2. Daniel Moore watched Eleanor Bennet take medicine with some concern. Where had she been just now? What was her relationship with Edward King? Daniel Moore recalled Edward King holding Eleanor Bennet's soft hand earlier, and a pang of jealousy rose in his heart. "Daniel, David King has agreed to the deal with me." Eleanor Bennet seemed very excited, completely unaware of Daniel Moore's current feelings. "Oh? So you went to see him just now?" Daniel Moore realized he had been overthinking. He should now focus all his efforts on helping Eleanor Bennet overcome this obstacle. "Yes, the assassin did me a great favor, otherwise, David King would never have given in so easily." "Eleanor Bennet, after you get the ledger, what do you plan to do? Having it with you might bring trouble." Daniel Moore frowned, knowing she had no intention of handing the ledger over to Charles King. "Daniel, honestly, I don't know. I can only take it one step at a time. If this ledger contains too many shocking secrets that could harm the people, perhaps I'll give it to the Emperor." Eleanor Bennet believed Alexander King was still a wise ruler, and it would be better to give it to him than to those vying for power. Daniel Moore did not doubt Eleanor Bennet's intentions. Her wisdom and strategy in court, apart from Charles King, were unmatched. Giving it to the Emperor was indeed the best solution. However, in this power-hungry court, could the Emperor truly be fair and just? He still worried about Eleanor Bennet's safety. "Daniel, I suspect many people are already watching me, so I'll need your help in the future." Eleanor Bennet felt fortunate to have a confidant she could entrust with her life. "Eleanor Bennet, I will do everything in my power." Daniel Moore was delighted by her trust, asking for nothing more in life. Eleanor Bennet laid out her entire plan. Daniel Moore admired her meticulous thinking even more. If she were a man, she would undoubtedly be a brilliant general. This time, even a cunning fox like Charles King might be within her calculations. The intelligence of a woman should never be underestimated. This strategy of shedding the cicada's shell had misled everyone, further eliminating suspicion from Eleanor Bennet at this moment. Her thoughtfulness, medical skills, intelligence, and courage made him respect her even more. At this moment, he realized that his previous worries seemed somewhat unnecessary. She was fully capable of protecting herself and was by no means just an ordinary noblewoman. As the night deepened, the cold wind, like a drunken man, battered the window bars. It wove through the desolate palace, sometimes howling madly, sometimes panting wearily. Bare branches trembled in the cold wind, swaying uneasily, while the moon seemed to hide behind the clouds, afraid of the cold. Trees rustled, and the gale swept the branches and leaves, dancing like the claws of a demon. Inside the Hall of Morning Flowers, the warmth from the incense burner seemed unable to repel the cold air seeping in. The person on the bed furrowed their brows slightly and casually waved a hand. A plume of white smoke immediately surged from the burner, obscuring even the flickering flames. A eunuch hurriedly approached under the pale moonlight. Seeing the man, he quickly bowed low in reverence. "Is everything arranged?" Charles King propped his chin with his hand and asked lazily, yet his words carried undiminished authority. "Reporting to your highness, everything has been carried out according to your orders. At this moment, His Majesty is reviewing King Edward's memorial." "Good, very good. From today onward, keep a close watch on Eleanor Bennet's every move." Charles King smiled meaningfully, as if he were the ultimate victor. "Your servant obeys." The eunuch, trembling, cast a fearful glance at the person on the bed before hastily retreating. Blood shadow. At Charles King's call, a shadowy figure swiftly emerged. "My lord." Blood Shadow appeared like a ghost, making the already eerily quiet Hall of Morning Flowers even more unsettling. "What's the status of Shadow's mission?" "Reporting, my lord, the Seven Kills sect has been eradicated. Shadow is now fully focused on hunting down the few remaining disciples. I want the sect master of the Seven Kills sect alive." Charles King's breathing seemed a little uneven, though his emotions remained unreadable. "Understood, my lord." "Any movements from Mount Cloudtop?" Illusionary Shadow reports that the Empress Dowager has completed 33 rounds of rituals. It seems she will return to court soon. Order Illusionary Shadow to continue monitoring. Charles King speculated that the Source family could no longer hold back, further proving the value of David King's ledger. Blood Shadow, assign someone to keep an eye on Daniel Moore. Assist him if necessary. Charles King smirked with satisfaction. He believed Eleanor Bennet wouldn't have taken that blade for no reason, and this was the perfect chance to uncover her true intentions. If she was an enemy, he would make sure she paid dearly. Eleanor Bennet was still too optimistic about what was to come. She did not yet understand Charles King. Years of navigating the treacherous palace had hardened him. He was cold and unfeeling. In his eyes, trust did not exist, only manipulation. That was the sole rule of a power-hungry tyrant. Without adhering to this rule, how could he have gained the authority to laugh at the world from his position today? His heart was not set on supreme power but on the cause of his past suffering and delusion. Everyone would pay the price. What he endured, he would reclaim 100-fold. As the final night of winter receded, the fiery horizon gradually lit up the billowing clouds. After months of recuperation, Alexander King finally appeared on the imperial throne in the Hall of Righteous Proclamation, gazing down arrogantly at the court officials. The Bryn dynasty, once in turmoil, seemed to be welcoming a new calm, much like the passing winter. Chapter 32, The Clark Dynasty. The court officials, seeing Alexander King suddenly attend the court, couldn't help but secretly whisper among themselves. Could it be that something major is about to happen today? Arthur Bennet stood expressionless, respectfully clasping his hands, yet his heart was filled with worry for Eleanor Bennet. Ever since learning that Eleanor Bennet had cured David King's madness, he had felt that the matter was far from simple. Why would Eleanor Bennet shield David King from a blade? What exactly was she planning in her heart? Arthur Bennet couldn't deny that since Eleanor Bennet fell into the water and lost her memory, his daughter seemed to have undergone a complete transformation. Whether in her thoughts or personality, she had become more composed and stable. Yet he could no longer fathom her intentions. Everything seemed to have spiraled out of his control. Though the incident in Camden Province had long been resolved, His Majesty had delayed addressing David King's case. The fact that David King went mad and was subsequently assassinated at this time, what could it signify? The more Arthur Bennet pondered, the more anxious he became, fearing that if Eleanor Bennet made a mistake, it would implicate the entire Bennet family. In the court hall, a heavy silence prevailed, with everyone speculating about what might occur today. Father, the Crown Prince embezzled relief funds meant for Camden Province and even instructed the provincial governor to bribe assassins to kill the imperial envoy. The evidence is now clear. I, your son, have followed your decree to investigate this matter and have come today to seek your directive. Edward King broke the silence in the Grand Hall. The court officials collectively exhaled in relief. It turned out to be about the Camden Province issue after all. If this matter has been thoroughly investigated, then handle it according to the law. Effective immediately, strip the Crown Prince David King of his title, exile him to White Tomb, and forbid his burial in the royal mausoleum after death. Confiscate all his assets and transfer them to the state treasury. His concubines, children, and servants are to be sent to the borderlands as slaves for generations. His mother, Consort Young, who has shown poor virtue and failed to raise her son properly, will be stripped of her title and confined to the cold palace from this day forward. Any officials involved in this case will be executed by beheading outside the Meridian Gate in 3 days, with their female relatives and servants conscripted as official courtesans, without any chance of pardon. Alexander King's voice exuded the authority and iciness of a sovereign. A cold wind swept through the hall, causing the court officials to shudder. The Crown Prince's faction had been completely eradicated, leaving the officials to ponder who might inherit the empire in the future. One wrong move could cost not only their lives but also the survival of their entire families. Long live the wise emperor! The officials trembled as they knelt to receive the decree. Your Majesty, the imperial examination is approaching. This year, 10 scholars have advanced to the final round. May I humbly ask if Your Majesty wishes to personally set the examination topic this year? Minister Page tactfully dispelled the heavy atmosphere in the court. Recruiting talent through the imperial examination is the foundation of the empire. However, I am aging and lack the energy for such tasks. Let this year's final examination topic be entrusted to King Edward. Alexander King turned to Edward King, his gaze filled with approval. Your son. Edward King was momentarily taken aback. Edward is dedicated to investigating the case in Camden Province, earning the people's favor, and I'm very pleased. Now that King Edward's residence is nearly complete, I grant him 1,000 acres of fertile land, 100 servants, and 100 sets of jewels and porcelain from the palace to celebrate. As the decree was announced, everyone in the hall looked at Edward King in astonishment. They wondered why the emperor, who had always been indifferent to King Edward, was suddenly acting differently today. Thank you, Father, for your generous grace, but the Camden Province case was not my achievement alone, and I dare not take all the credit. Edward King knelt to express his gratitude, maintaining a humble demeanor. Having merit without arrogance, Edward's virtues are indeed commendable. Today, I appoint the 4th Prince, Edward King, as the virtuous king, and the 5th Prince, Richard King, as king. The Ministry of Internal Affairs should find suitable locations outside the palace to build residences for the two princes. Alexander King knew what Edward King desired and had intended to confer titles upon his two sons, seizing this opportunity to do so. Had feelings for Eleanor Bennet. I will certainly bring my daughter to pay her respects. Arthur Bennet replied, already formulating a plan in his mind. Arthur Bennet left the palace and exited through Main Clark Gate. He hurriedly got into his carriage and returned home. Upon arriving, he immediately sent someone to the palace to convey a message, asking Eleanor Bennet to visit whenever she had time. Although the matter with David King had settled, he still felt uneasy. He needed to find out the truth. Edward King, along with Edward King and Richard King, left the palace and headed towards their new residence in the western part of the city. The three rode horses, followed by dozens of guards, quickly arriving in front of a magnificent mansion. 3 large red doors inlaid with gold, several towering pillars stood imposingly. On either side of the entrance were 2 mythical creatures, both exquisitely sculpted. Edward King looked up, noticing the 3 golden letters, King Edward Residence, emphasizing royal majesty. Third brother, this time the Ministry of Internal Affairs has done quite an efficient job, remarked Prince Edward King, standing behind Edward King, seemingly pleased. Let's go inside and take a look. Edward King said, stepping up the stone steps into the residence. An official, appearing to be in charge of the project, immediately stepped forward to pay his respects. Your Highness, King Edward, Prince David, Your Highness King. Who are you? Edward King asked, looking at his official attire, guessing he was an official from the Ministry of Works. I am an external official of the Ministry of Works, in charge of constructing the King Edward residence this time. Minister Du, you've worked hard. I'm just here to take a look today. Edward King gestured for him to rise. Billy Butcher, not daring to delay, slowly followed behind. Entering the residence from the gate, there was a floral hall, with both sides paved with warm goose-colored stone. In front of the hall was a white jade screen engraved with a spring bamboo and wealth painting. Walking through a narrow path behind the screen, the space suddenly opened up. The lawn pavilion, water pavilion, with railings carved from jade, was mesmerizingly beautiful and exquisitely detailed. Passing through the winding corridor led to the main hall. The main hall was several feet wide, with a set of sandalwood carved Grand Master's chairs and a triangular table in the center. Various colorful plants were arranged around the hall. Several ancient paintings by famous artists hung on the walls. Third brother, your residence is even more luxurious than the Palace of Scenic Blossoms. Richard King approached, admiringly observing the authentic craftsmanship. Fifth brother, when your residence is completed, I will also gift you a few items. Edward King, sitting in the main seat, was in high spirits. Minister Du, your hard work is commendable. I will certainly request a reward for you. Edward King addressed Billy Butcher, who stood upright after bowing. This man was indeed clever, knowing well the prince's fondness for elegant things. Thank you, Your Highness King Edward. Billy Butcher bowed in gratitude and tactfully withdrew. Third brother, don't you find father acting strangely today? Edward King, sitting beside him, looked troubled and contemplative. Fourth brother, tell me what you think. Edward King also sensed something unusual. In the past, no matter how much we contributed to the kingdom, father would at most offer a few words of praise, some trinkets, or palace attendance. But today, bestowing titles, granting residences and lands, this is the first time. Edward King glanced at Edward King, choosing not to elaborate further. Fourth brother makes a valid point. I also feel father was somewhat excessive today. Richard King had returned from viewing the painting to his seat. Currently, father is aging, yet he hasn't mentioned appointing a crown prince. The court officials are increasingly opportunistic, merely standing by and waiting. All eligible princes have been granted titles, making father's intentions harder to discern. Edward King analyzed the current situation, which seemed clear but held underlying risks. Currently, the elder has fallen from power, but the influence of the So family remains unaffected. For a long time, the emperor has wanted to eliminate the external influence of the So family, but he hasn't found an excuse yet. Now that the records have completely disappeared, I suspect he wants to cultivate us to counter the power of the Duke of Stirling. Edward King seemed to see through Alexander King's overly ostentatious display today. If what third brother says is true, doesn't that mean the emperor wants to use us and has no intention of passing the throne to us? Does he only want to protect the ninth prince? Richard King, with a hint of anger, questioned why they were treated so harshly despite being princes of the same bloodline. Fifth brother, as long as our brotherhood is strong enough, what can the emperor do to us in the future? If the emperor gives us the opportunity to build our power, we should make the most of it. Edward King smirked coldly, not the type to be easily manipulated. The fourth person, I entrust you with the matters of the elder statesmen in the court. After today's events, those old men will certainly take action. The fifth person, I leave the imperial guards and the generals to you. You already have a good relationship with them, just control the military power of the imperial guard in the capital, and even father will have to concede. Edward King and Richard King both nodded, as they would never dare to neglect their duty to Edward King. Third brother, we received news from Mount Cloudtop yesterday that the Empress Dowager will soon return to the palace. Edward King said. She finally couldn't hold back any longer. Edward King clenched his fists in anger, his bright eyes filled with hatred. The absence of a member of the So family in the palace is certainly a blow to them. Edward King understood the source of his rage. The matter with David King is settled, but the accounts must be thoroughly investigated. Edward King didn't believe everything could be forgotten. As long as there was a glimmer of hope, he wouldn't give up. Until the last moment, the winner couldn't be determined. Eleanor Bennet stood in the courtyard of the Imperial Medical Institute, feeling relieved as she watched David King being led away by the guards. With just a simple exchange of glances, Eleanor Bennet knew David King was ready. Then, she entered Daniel Moore's room, where he was focused on mixing medicinal ingredients, completely unaware of Eleanor Bennet's presence. Daniel! Eleanor Bennet called, looking at his busy figure. You're here, make yourself comfortable, I'll be done soon. Daniel Moore said as he added some powder into a porcelain bottle. Daniel, what is this? Eleanor Bennet asked curiously. Mi-hun-san. Daniel Moore replied. A sedative? Eleanor Bennet knew that in ancient times, there were substances similar to anesthetics, but she didn't expect Daniel Moore to know how to make them. Yes. If we want to successfully take David King's body away, we can't do it without this. Daniel Moore said with a smile. Looks like you have a plan. I'll wait here for good news from you. Eleanor Bennet originally intended to ask about the details of rescuing David King, but seeing his confidence, she decided not to. Eleanor Bennet, do you really think David King will hand over the accounts to us? Daniel Moore still felt a bit worried. It was known that Charles King had been searching for this item for a long time without any leads. Surely, David King wouldn't be so easy to deal with. I'm not entirely sure, I just know he doesn't want to die. As long as he wants to live, he will have to comply. Eleanor Bennet had also considered Daniel Moore's concerns. However, there was no other option at the moment. Is Lord Bennet here? At that moment, a shrill voice sounded from outside. Eleanor Bennet, please come in. Eleanor Bennet stepped outside and saw a eunuch. His Highness King requests your presence, the eunuch said. What does the prince require? Eleanor Bennet felt a bit anxious at the thought of David King. The prince hasn't specified, but you'll find out if you come with us. The eunuch, speaking coldly, seemed reluctant to say more. Eleanor Bennet, I'll accompany you. At this moment, Daniel Moore also stepped out, noticing Eleanor Bennet's troubled expression and moved forward to assist. Mr. Moore, the prince only invited Master Bennet, please don't make it difficult for me. The eunuch hurriedly stopped Daniel Moore from accompanying them. Daniel, perhaps he needs me for a medical consultation, you have more important matters to attend to. Eleanor Bennet signaled with her eyes, indicating to Daniel Moore not to miss significant tasks over minor issues. Daniel Moore could only watch silently as Eleanor Bennet left, though he suspected what she might be thinking. Did David King truly not understand Eleanor Bennet's intentions? Why did he always feel that things were not as simple as they seemed? Since receiving his master's order to descend the mountain to assist David King, he had never seen any of David King's plans fail. Would this time be an exception? The eunuch led Eleanor Bennet not towards the Hall of Morning Flowers, but to the Imperial Gardens. Seeing the different direction, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel suspicious. Eunuch, aren't we supposed to go to the Hall of Morning Flowers? Eleanor Bennet slowed her pace, her instincts telling her something was amiss. Master Bennet, the prince is waiting in the Imperial Gardens, the eunuch replied calmly. The prince usually dislikes the cold, why would he be in the Imperial Gardens in this weather? Eleanor Bennet felt something was wrong and decided to turn back. Master Bennet, we're almost there. The eunuch unexpectedly grabbed Eleanor Bennet with astonishing agility. Who are you? Eleanor Bennet realized this person knew martial arts. Was there some conspiracy? Master Bennet, it is the Emperor who summons you. Please follow me. Hearing it was the Emperor, Eleanor Bennet grew even more suspicious. Why would the Emperor impersonate David King to summon her? Eleanor Bennet followed the eunuch to the knock hole in the Imperial Gardens, where a royal barge was docked. A few eunuchs stood waiting by the lake. Your Majesty, Lord Bennet has arrived, the eunuch reported into the royal barge. Eleanor Bennet looked at the shadowy figure behind the silk curtain. Could it really be the Emperor? She glanced around, wondering why Eunuch Liam was not present. Let her in. Eleanor Bennet recognized the voice as that of Alexander King. She slowly stepped onto the royal barge, standing outside the silk curtain. At that moment, the eunuchs simultaneously boarded the boat, and the royal barge quickly moved to the center of the lake. Eleanor Bennet observed them. They didn't seem like the usual servants from the Hall of Heavenly Purity. Moreover, their steps were light and skillful, clearly indicating they were martial arts experts. It was evident that Alexander King did not want anyone to know about this meeting. Eleanor Bennet, come in. Alexander King suddenly spoke, inviting Eleanor Bennet inside. She slowly entered and saw Alexander King in casual attire, sitting on the throne with no attendants around. I greet your Majesty. Eleanor Bennet knelt and saluted, occasionally glancing at Alexander King. "How is your injury?" Alexander King looked at Eleanor Bennet kneeling on the ground but did not instruct her to stand. "Thank you for your concern, Your Majesty." "My injury is stable," Eleanor Bennet replied calmly, lightly touching her still bandaged right arm. "I meet you here today because I want to hear an honest word from you. I understand you are an exceptionally intelligent woman, but even the wise can't avoid occasional cunning. I admire talent and do not wish to see you go astray in the future. Your Majesty's concern is appreciated, but I am just an ordinary woman, perhaps slightly bolder. As for the matter Your Majesty mentioned, please clarify." Eleanor Bennet did not shy away from Alexander King's cold gaze. "Today, he set up this situation merely to probe. Does he suspect any dealings between her and David King? I just want to know why you shielded David King from an assassin's knife. You clearly knew he was a criminal awaiting execution, yet you risked your life to protect him." Alexander King spoke directly, addressing the issue without hesitation. "Your Majesty, while the Crown Prince may be a criminal awaiting execution to you, to me, he is merely a patient. A good doctor is like a caring parent. Risking my life to save him was simply instinct." Eleanor Bennet, after hearing Alexander King's words, felt less tense. So, this was his only suspicion. Alexander King looked at Eleanor Bennet for a long time and then suddenly laughed heartily. His previously aggressive demeanor vanished instantly. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but marvel at the unpredictable nature of the Emperor's mind. The daughter raised by Arthur Bennet is indeed remarkable. Alexander King praised with a hint of mystery. "Escort Lord Bennet ashore," he ordered the attendants outside. Eleanor Bennet saluted and took her leave, stepping off the flower boat. She realized that the boat had stopped in the middle of the lake, with the red walls of the palace visible in the distance. If Alexander King wanted to take her life today, he could have easily thrown her into the lake, and no one would have known. People would merely think it was the doing of the evil David King, without suspecting the brave and wise emperor. Eleanor Bennet stood on the small boat, gazing at the flower boat in the middle of the lake. Suddenly, she realized that Alexander King's terror far surpassed that of David King. From now on, she must be even more cautious. The palace's atmosphere was too murky. Once Eleanor Bennet stepped into it, there was no way out. An unfathomable emperor, a cold and sinister David King, an outwardly refined and courteous Edward King, and the cunning Arthur Bennet, all of it gave her a headache. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but blame herself. Even after being reborn, she couldn't find peace. Chapter 33, Words of Governance. The small boat swayed and quickly reached the shore. Eleanor Bennet sighed in relief, her tense heart finally relaxing a little. "Lord Bennet has arrived, please watch your step." Eleanor Bennet heard the eunuch who had escorted her earlier reminding her. "Thank you, sir." Eleanor Bennet stepped off the boat and returned the courtesy. She cast a glance at the flower boat faintly visible in the middle of the lake before turning to leave. Today, she had clearly felt the killing intent emanating from Alexander King. Yet why he didn't make a move, she couldn't understand. She wasn't naive enough to believe he had been convinced by her lies. "Miss, be careful." Lost in thought, Eleanor Bennet didn't notice the path ahead and bumped into a firm chest. "Why is it you?" Eleanor Bennet looked up, meeting the icy gaze of Charles King. She tried to step back, but he held her tightly in his arms, leaving her unable to move. "Where have you come from?" Charles King glanced toward the Jade Lake, his tone as if he already knew everything. I was just strolling by the lake, Eleanor Bennet replied, not intending to recount what had just happened. Oh? The wind by the lake is so strong, weren't you afraid of falling into the water? Charles King's seemingly casual remark sent a ripple through Eleanor Bennet's heart. And you? With such strong winds, can your body handle it? Eleanor Bennet retorted without backing down. She was well aware that today's encounter was anything but coincidental. You're getting bolder by the day. Charles King slowly leaned closer, his hand tightening around her waist. Charles King, what are you trying to do? Eleanor Bennet glared at him angrily, her heart racing, though a blush crept across her face. Woman, you should know. Charles King sneered, leaning in to kiss Eleanor Bennet. The familiar sweet taste intoxicated him once again. Eleanor Bennet felt the possessiveness in his kiss, yet a faint sense of euphoria arose within her. Charles King, can't you survive without taking advantage of me? Eleanor Bennet attempted to bite him again, but this time she failed. Charles King released her, amused by the sight of the furious woman before him. When angered, she was even more radiant and captivating. Woman, come with me. Charles King glanced toward the distant corridor with a cold smile. Where are you taking me? Eleanor Bennet followed his gaze but saw nothing. Even so, she felt as though someone was watching them intently. Charles King didn't answer, just pulled her towards the Radiant Sun Gate. Eleanor Bennet knew she couldn't change his mind, so she obediently followed. They quickly reached the Radiant Sun Gate, where Blood Shadow had a carriage ready and waiting. Master. Blood Shadow saw Eleanor Bennet and seemed unsurprised. Charles King got into the carriage and turned to help Eleanor Bennet. She was momentarily stunned by his unexpected gesture but then handed him her arm. This cold-faced man showed a surprising gentleness. At that moment, Edward King returned to the palace and, seeing Charles King and Eleanor Bennet in the carriage, couldn't help but feel jealous. Fourth brother, have someone follow them. Edward King instructed the person beside him, then rode into the Radiant Sun Gate. Edward King watched the carriage disappear and signaled the guards to follow. Then he also rode after Edward King. The relationship between Eleanor Bennet and the nine-tailed fox was certainly not simple. If not for the warning from the third brother, he would have eliminated the threat long ago. Eleanor Bennet noticed the carriage's direction seemed different from that of the bamboo forest hot springs. Today was not a new moon, so Charles King's poison wouldn't act up. What was his plan in taking her out? Eleanor Bennet glanced at Charles King, who was resting with his eyes closed, feeling anxious. Master, someone is following us. Blood Shadow reported from outside. Oh? Charles King opened his eyes but didn't move. Little girl, someone is very concerned about you. Charles King lazily leaned back with a hand warmer. How do you know they're following me? Why not you? Eleanor Bennet retorted. When it came to attracting attention, he was definitely more noticeable than she was. Little girl, it seems I need to make you mine soon to stop others from thinking about you. Charles King's voice was teasing, but Eleanor Bennet ignored him, trying to peer through the curtain to see who was following. No need to look, it's Edward King's men. Charles King seemed to know the answer already. Edward King? Eleanor Bennet recalled that the figure riding into the Radiant Sun Gate did resemble him. He seems quite interested in you. Charles King smiled at Eleanor Bennet, his rare smile as beautiful as blooming peach blossoms. Eleanor Bennet didn't believe Edward King had someone follow her out of personal interest. She had anticipated that many would be paying attention to her lately. Could Edward King have figured out her intentions? Eleanor Bennet felt immense pressure. Acting under the watchful eyes of so many schemers was not easy. The carriage headed east, turned onto a large road, and then stopped. Through the curtain, Eleanor Bennet saw a magnificent mansion. She stepped down from the carriage and looked up to see the words, Prince Charles's residence, powerfully engraved on a golden plaque. Standing before the grand mansion, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but be amazed. What did you bring me here for? Eleanor Bennet never expected Charles King to bring her to his new estate. To show you what might need improvement, so you won't complain when you move in later, Charles King said as he walked into the estate, leaving Eleanor Bennet stunned. What? Move in? Eleanor Bennet stood there, mouth agape, completely dumbfounded. Lady Bennet, come inside. Blood Shadow, seeing Eleanor Bennet frozen in place, couldn't help but chuckle. Oh! Eleanor Bennet exhaled deeply. With your cold demeanor, even if this estate were gilded in gold, I wouldn't care. She stepped into the estate, the astonishment still evident on her face. Charles King, did you move the entire imperial gardens here? Eleanor Bennet gazed at the jade-carved corridors and the magnificent, luxurious pavilions, seemingly even more splendid than the imperial gardens. Do you like it? Charles King stood on the tower, gazing absent-mindedly at the lake. Squandering the people's labor and resources. Eleanor Bennet remarked with a hint of disdain, showing no sign of being impressed. So what? As long as I like it. A trace of contempt flashed in Charles King's eyes. Charles King, do you realize that just because of your liking, the people of the kingdom have to exhaust all their efforts? Here, a single tree or blade of grass might represent a year's livelihood for them. Your extravagant wastefulness, have you ever considered the well-being of the people? The sages said, the ruler is the boat, and the people are the water. Water can carry the boat, but it can also overturn it. As a king, everything must prioritize the foundation, and the foundation of a nation is its people. The people's basic needs like food and clothing are paramount, and all matters related to them should adhere to fundamental principles. If you don't even understand this, how can you govern the kingdom? Even if you gain the world, how long can you hold on to it? Eleanor Bennet's cold expression exuded an air of authority. Charles King was momentarily taken aback as he stared at the woman before him. Her discourse on governance, where did it come from? Every word and sentence was a truth, making even him feel inadequate. Women from Britain didn't read books, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to articulate such thoughts. She seemed more and more extraordinary to him, like an unsolvable mystery. Eleanor Bennet noticed Charles King's silence and realized she had said too much. Why did she always feel the urge to argue? This time, Charles King would surely grow even more suspicious of her identity. Thinking of Bryn, they wouldn't know anything about Taizong or Wei Zheng. What she said today was undoubtedly ahead of its time. Who taught you such words? A flicker of doubt indeed appeared in Charles King's eyes. I accidentally came across them in the palace library, Eleanor Bennet reluctantly lied. Arthur Bennet certainly knows how to educate his daughter, David King sneered coldly, leaving the tower and heading toward the distant mansion. Eleanor Bennet could sense the hidden meaning in his words. After all, this wasn't the first time he had doubted her. Let him think whatever he wants. Blood Shadow, escort Lady Bennet back to the palace. Eleanor Bennet was surprised that David King let her off so easily. She took one last look at the opulent building. These royals truly lived in excess, and she feared that Bryn's century-old legacy couldn't withstand such extravagance. Sitting in the carriage, Eleanor Bennet carefully pondered today's events. First, there was the secret summons from Alexander King, followed by the chance encounter by the lake with David King. Surely, these two events were closely linked. David King must have stationed someone to watch her, which is why her being taken to Jade Lake was quickly exposed. But why did he come to Jade Lake? Could it be to rescue her? This reason seemed too far-fetched, even Eleanor Bennet found it hard to believe. His rescuing her was simply too unbelievable. Blood Shadow, take me back to the Bennet residence. Eleanor Bennet smiled, instructing Blood Shadow outside the carriage. She guessed that Daniel would make a move in the coming days, so she decided to feign illness and stay home. After all, too many eyes in the palace were on her, making it unsuitable for her to act. The carriage soon arrived at the gates of the Bennet residence. Eleanor Bennet stepped down and thanked Blood Shadow, leaving him awkwardly unsure of how to respond. She smiled and walked away, paying him no further attention. "Miss, you're finally back." A servant at the door, upon seeing Eleanor Bennet, rushed inside to inform the steward. Watching the servant's hurried departure, Eleanor Bennet wondered if her father was also looking for her. "Miss, the master sent someone to the palace with a message early today. Why have you only returned now?" The steward asked anxiously, confirming that Arthur Bennet was indeed searching for her. "Is mother at the residence?" Eleanor Bennet suddenly remembered her wound hadn't fully healed and thought it best not to worry Lady Bennet. "Madam went to the Golden Flower Temple to pray yesterday and hasn't returned yet. The master is currently in the study," the steward replied. "All right, inform my father that I'll pay my respects later. Also, send someone to the Imperial Medical Institute, telling them I'm ill and need a few days' leave." After giving her instructions, Eleanor Bennet returned to her room. Clara Young, upon seeing Eleanor Bennet, was initially joyful but then became alarmed. "Miss, what happened to your arm?" Clara Young asked worriedly. "It's nothing." Eleanor Bennet entered the room, sat on the bed, and asked Clara Young to bring scissors and clean water. She unwrapped the white bandage from her arm herself. Her wound had mostly healed, and the bandage was only meant to divert attention. Looking at the wound slowly closing, Eleanor Bennet sighed, fearing it would leave a scar. Clara Young entered, saw the over a foot-long wound on Eleanor Bennet's shoulder, and couldn't hold back her tears. "All right, don't cry anymore." Eleanor Bennet gently pinched Clara Young's high nose. "Miss, what happened to you again?" Clara Young couldn't understand where this knife wound came from. "I'm fine." "Quickly, fetch my medicine box." Clara Young hurriedly brought it over. Eleanor Bennet disinfected the wound and applied her self-made ointment. This ointment, after being improved by Daniel Moore, was indeed very effective. "Clara Young, prepare a set of men's clothing," Eleanor Bennet ordered. "Huh? Miss, what do you need men's clothes for?" "Hurry, don't ask too much." Eleanor Bennet changed her outfit and sat in front of the dressing table, brushing her hair. "Oh!" Clara Young hesitated but left. Eleanor Bennet looked at herself in the mirror, her plan already forming in her mind. Clara Young brought several sets of men's clothing. Eleanor Bennet tried them on, apart from being slightly loose, everything else was fine. Looking at the fabric, it didn't seem like something a servant would wear. "Clara Young, where did you get these?" "Miss, these belonged to the young master before." Eleanor Bennet suddenly understood. She had almost forgotten she had an older brother she had never met. Clara Young, adjust them to fit my size. I'm going to see father. Eleanor Bennet tossed the clothes to Clara Young and left her room. Eleanor Bennet stepped into the study, where Arthur Bennet seemed to be waiting for her. Father. Eleanor Bennet bowed her head in greeting. Eleanor, your injury. Arthur Bennet looked at Eleanor Bennet but didn't notice anything unusual. The injury has improved a lot, there's basically nothing to worry about. Eleanor Bennet was certain that the butler must have reported her right arm being suspended earlier. That's good, I was worried sick. You unfilial daughter. Eleanor Bennet displayed a humble expression. Eleanor, what on earth happened? How did you get involved with the Crown Prince, and why are you injured? Arthur Bennet anxiously sought the truth. Father, the Emperor didn't believe the Crown Prince had gone mad, so he specifically tasked me with diagnosing him. Unexpectedly, I was captured by an assassin. That assassin intended to kill the Crown Prince. In the chaos, I was accidentally injured. Eleanor Bennet summarized the events. You say the assassin wanted to kill the Crown Prince? A look of worry flashed across Arthur Bennet's face. Yes, I also find it strange. Why go to such lengths for a madman? Eleanor Bennet observed Arthur Bennet's expression shift from surprise to concern. Eleanor Bennet, there are things one should not know too clearly. Arthur Bennet's sudden cold demeanor only deepened Eleanor Bennet's suspicion. Father, do you know something? I've not been in the palace long, and I fear a small mistake could lead to a major error. Not only would it harm me, but if it implicates the Bennet family, then I would truly be guilty. Eleanor Bennet intentionally showed a hint of worry. Xiao Shui, in the palace, you cannot rely solely on your eyes, you must use your heart to observe everything. The Emperor's will is unpredictable, and hidden factions are constantly vying for power. As your father, I feel as if I am walking on thin ice. Father, are you referring to the power struggle between King Edward and Duke Wang? Xiao Shui, it's not just that. If it were merely two factions, it would be simpler to say four. Four factions? The Duke of Stirling, and the Emperor is among them. The Emperor? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but recall the incident on the flower boat. Xiao Shui, you can disregard anyone's intentions, but you must never ignore the Emperor's decree. Remember this while you're in the palace. Eleanor Bennet listened to Arthur Bennet's warning, feeling trapped in a maze. How much of what she saw was real, and how much was an illusion? Suddenly, Eleanor Bennet felt that the one sitting on the throne was the mastermind behind these endless struggles. Eleanor Bennet left the study, walking through the night back to her chamber. She wondered how things were progressing on Daniel Moore's side. Perhaps many mysteries would only be solved once they obtained that ledger. For now, she could only wait. The next morning, Clara Young had finished mending the garment. Eleanor Bennet tried it on, and it fit perfectly. Clara Young, your craftsmanship is truly excellent. Eleanor Bennet praised while standing in front of the mirror. My lady, this outfit of yours does bear some resemblance to the young master's. Clara Young commented as she observed Eleanor Bennet in the male attire. Oh? Clara Young, does my brother rarely come home? Eleanor Bennet suddenly grew curious about Henry Bennet. Yes, my lady. The young master is stationed at the border. Unless there's a royal decree, he's usually not permitted to return to the capital, Clara Young replied while folding the male attire Eleanor Bennet had just taken off. Eleanor Bennet changed back into her dress and sat before the mirror, waiting for Clara Young to comb her hair. It was no surprise that the Bennet family matron didn't want Eleanor Bennet to enter the palace. With both her children away, it was only natural for her to feel heartbroken. Arthur Bennet, though a conservative old man, had no concubines and only one son and one daughter. In terms of affection, he could be considered loyal. At least the Bennet matron didn't have to endure the struggles between a main wife and concubines. If she herself could find a man like that, it would be satisfactory. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but recall David King and his comment about her living in his manor in the future. Thinking about his half-serious, half-joking expression left Eleanor Bennet feeling uneasy. Why had he taken her on a tour of his manor yesterday? Eleanor Bennet truly didn't understand, but she absolutely refused to believe he was her ideal man. In her heart, she despised men like him, those who only knew how to squander wealth. She admired men who were tolerant, righteous, and full of charisma. David King did not fit that image at all. In the icy cold of the night, several dark figures flashed by and disappeared in an instant amidst the streets. Inside the detention center of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, an unusual silence prevailed. The hurried footsteps of Edward King broke the stillness. He glanced at David King, who remained motionless in the cell, his heart filled with doubt. At that moment, a guard emerged from the cell and stepped forward to report. "Your Highness, the Crown Prince has suddenly died." "What was the cause?" Edward King asked curiously. "The execution was scheduled for tomorrow, yet tonight he had suddenly died. We couldn't determine the cause. Take him out and find a place to bury him. After all, he was a condemned man, whether he died sooner or later made no difference." David King, a criminal, could not be buried in the royal tombs and could only be left to rot in the wilderness. Such was the nature of royal authority, cold and ruthless. Edward King turned and left the prison, but a sense of unease lingered in his heart. David King's death was too strange. A few guards dragged David King's body to a desolate mountain, preparing to bury him. Suddenly, eerie cries echoed, startling them and unsettling their spirits. Without properly burying the body, they fled the forest in panic. At that moment, a figure dressed in black appeared, knelt down to examine David King, and then carried him away from the desolate mountain. Upon reaching the foot of the mountain, the figure encountered another group of people. "Who are you? Why are you taking David King's body?" the leader asked with a menacing tone. "It's none of your concern," replied the figure in black, attempting to escape but was quickly intercepted by the group. During the fight, the figure in black seemed to be at a disadvantage. Just then, several other figures in black appeared, seemingly there to assist. The figure swiftly escaped, taking David King with him and vanishing into the night. On a nearby hillside, a few more individuals stood silently, observing the scene unfold. "Blood shadow, leave no one alive below." Charles King donned a black cloak, his face completely obscured, his voice filled with murderous intent. "Understood, my lord." Blood Shadow obeyed the order. Charles King gazed into the pitch-black night, devoid of any moonlight, and suddenly let out a cold laugh. "Eleanor Bennet, you truly did not disappoint me." With that, Charles King moved, vanishing swiftly into the darkness. His light-footed skills seemed to have reached an extraordinary level. Chapter 34, Underlying Currents. Early the next morning, Eleanor Bennet woke up early to groom herself. Clara Young attended to her, combing her hair. "Miss, your hair is done." Seeing Eleanor Bennet lost in thought in front of the mirror for a while, Clara Young reminded her. "Oh, Eleanor Bennet snapped back to reality, gazing at her sparkling eyes in the mirror and her radiant beauty. She suddenly sighed, "Youth truly is wonderful. Clara Young, your hair combing skills are improving day by day." Eleanor Bennet complimented. "Miss, you're teasing me again." Eleanor Bennet looked at Clara Young behind her and laughed. This girl was truly amusing. "Clara Young, I'm hungry. Go prepare breakfast quickly." Eleanor Bennet noticed Clara Young's blushing face, then sat down on the bed to drink tea. Clara Young acknowledged the order and left. Breakfast was quickly served, and Eleanor Bennet ate with great appetite. The steward then arrived, seeing Eleanor Bennet dining, and waited respectfully outside the door. "Steward, is there something you need?" Eleanor Bennet asked upon noticing him. "Miss, someone from the palace just delivered a box, saying it was sent especially for you by Mr. Moore for nourishment," the steward reported respectfully. "Bring it in." Hearing Daniel Moore's name, Eleanor Bennet felt a surge of joy. The steward placed the brocade box down and withdrew. Eleanor Bennet ate a few more bites hastily, then instructed Clara Young to clear the table. She took the box and walked over to her study desk. Opening it, she found a sprig of dogwood inside. Eleanor Bennet immediately understood. Daniel Moore had succeeded and had smoothly rescued David King. The next step required her personal involvement. Eleanor Bennet changed into men's attire, preparing to leave the residence. "Miss, are you going out?" "Clara Young, such a beautiful day today, come take a walk with me," Eleanor Bennet said as she stepped out of her chamber. "Miss, are you planning to go out again?" Clara Young stood still, not moving an inch. "Then stay home, I can go on my own." Eleanor Bennet didn't really want to bring her along anyway. The fewer people who knew about her activities, the better. That way, Clara Young would also be safer. "If anyone asks, just say I'm resting. Do not allow anyone to disturb me," Eleanor Bennet instructed. "Yes, miss, I understand," Clara Young replied. Taking advantage of the servants still having breakfast, Eleanor Bennet quietly slipped out of the Bennet residence. She didn't head straight to Harmony Hall but instead strolled leisurely through the streets, not seeming in any rush. Suddenly, Eleanor Bennet spotted a bustling tailor shop, filled with customers coming and going. Intrigued, she stepped inside, and a shop assistant immediately approached to greet her. "Miss, please take a look. These are all the latest designs. The materials are of the finest quality. Just look at the stitching and the styles, there's no other shop like this in town." The assistant eagerly introduced, his eyes assessing Eleanor Bennet. Seeing her dressed in luxurious attire, he was certain she was a wealthy young lady. "Do you have a back door in this shop?" Eleanor Bennet asked discreetly in a quieter corner. "Yes, we do," the assistant replied curiously. "I'll take all these outfits," Eleanor Bennet pointed to several dresses on display. "Miss, you have excellent taste. Allow me to pack them up for you right away." The assistant beamed with joy, thrilled to have encountered such a generous customer. "Here's the money for the clothes, and this is for you," Eleanor Bennet handed him 2 silver ingots. "Miss, this is far too much." The assistant's eyes lit up as he stared at the silver. "You deserve it." "Now, I need to use the fitting room for a moment," Eleanor Bennet said, heading into a private room while the assistant respectfully waited outside. She changed into men's attire and then stepped out. "Remember, you didn't see me today, understood?" Eleanor Bennet warned. "I understand completely." The assistant nodded repeatedly, immediately grasping her meaning. Keep my clothes safe, I'll return for them, Eleanor Bennet said with a satisfied smile. Rest assured, miss. Now, lead me to the back door. Eleanor Bennet glanced outside, ensuring no one had noticed her. This way, miss, the assistant led her to the back courtyard, and she quickly exited the shop. Watching her leave, the assistant seemed to piece things together. Surely, this young lady was sneaking off to meet her lover. Eleanor Bennet resumed her stroll through the streets, heading straight for Harmony Hall. She wondered if this method would help her evade the tail that had been following her. Entering Harmony Hall, she noticed several young assistants busy at the medicine counter. Glancing toward the private rooms on the other side, she saw no sign of Daniel. Moore. Little servant, is Dr. Moore here? Eleanor Bennet stepped forward to ask a young servant. My elder brother has been ill for a long time and hasn't recovered. We wish to invite Dr. Moore for treatment. Oh, young master, please wait a moment. The servant quickly went into the inner hall. Eleanor Bennet sat in the main hall, observing Harmony Hall. Since Daniel entered the palace, this place had indeed become much quieter. At that time, she only thought about herself and never considered him. Now, pulling him into this whirlpool of struggles, she truly felt a bit selfish. Daniel Moore emerged from the inner hall and noticed Eleanor Bennet in the main hall. Master, this is the young gentleman looking for you. The servant stepped forward to inform. Dr. Moore. Eleanor Bennet smiled faintly, not revealing her true identity. And you are? Daniel Moore looked at the person before him, finding her familiar but unable to recall immediately. I go by the name Bennet, Eleanor Bennet reminded him. Snow, Daniel Moore was about to call her name but stopped himself. Little fish, close the main door. We're taking the day off. Daniel Moore instructed, then walked with Eleanor Bennet into the inner chamber. Eleanor Bennet, why are you? Daniel Moore couldn't help but ask as soon as they entered. Daniel, it's not convenient to talk here. Eleanor Bennet signaled for him to remain silent. All right, let's talk in my room. Daniel Moore glanced cautiously outside, and the two of them passed through the courtyard to his room. Daniel, where is David King now? Eleanor Bennet got straight to the point as soon as they entered. He's in the room, still unconscious. I just checked on him, he should wake up soon. Was everything smooth last night? Eleanor Bennet asked, still worried. More or less. We encountered a group of men in black, but then another group came to our rescue. I was very cautious, deliberately taking a roundabout way before returning to Harmony Hall. Daniel Moore recounted the events of the previous night. You said two groups of people appeared? Eleanor Bennet couldn't hide her astonishment. It seemed they were still being watched. Who could those two groups be? Charles King? Edward King? Or was it the hidden hand aiming to silence them? Eleanor Bennet knew this matter needed to be resolved quickly to avoid further complications. I'll go check on David King first. Daniel Moore responded and led Eleanor Bennet to another room. Eleanor Bennet walked in and immediately saw David King lying straight on the bed, looking no different from a corpse. She moved closer, checked his pulse, pupils, and heartbeat, and then sighed in relief. She took out a silver needle and pricked several acupuncture points on the top of David King's head. Within the time it takes to drink a cup of tea, David King regained consciousness. Eleanor Bennet sat on the opposite bed, smiling at him. Where am I? David King asked, looking at Eleanor Bennet dressed in men's clothing without showing any surprise. You're still among the living. Eleanor Bennet replied playfully. I thank you, Lord Bennet, for saving my life, David King said, getting off the bed to kneel in gratitude. He couldn't deny that this woman had extraordinary skills. There's no need for formalities, Your Highness. Now that you're safe, it's time to fulfill your promise, Eleanor Bennet said, uninterested in dealing with any pretense. Are you referring to the accounts? David King's eyes gleamed with cunning. Does Your Highness really need to ask? Eleanor Bennet saw through his thoughts, wondering if he intended to go back on his word. Try pressing on the lower right side of your abdomen, does it hurt? Eleanor Bennet stood beside him, smiling coldly. David King did as she instructed and indeed felt pain, his eyes filling with suspicion. There's a poison in your body, and if you don't receive the antidote within 3 days, your entire body will rot and die. I think you wouldn't be foolish enough to risk that after just escaping death, Eleanor Bennet said disdainfully, having anticipated his betrayal and prepared accordingly. Eleanor Bennet, you truly are ruthless. David King exclaimed in anger. Where are the accounts, Your Highness? Eleanor Bennet asked. In the room of the courtesan Shan Wu at Yen Wang, hidden in the space between the third brick from the flower shelf, Edward King revealed, forced by the threat to his life. Yen Wang Inn? Eleanor Bennet mused, recognizing it as a brothel. David King was indeed clever, who would think to look there? Daniel, keep him with you for a few days. Release him once we have the accounts, Eleanor Bennet instructed Daniel Moore beside her, preparing to leave. Eleanor Bennet, what about the antidote? Edward King asked anxiously. I'll give it to you once I have the accounts, Eleanor Bennet replied, leaving the room. When did you poison David King? Daniel Moore asked, following Eleanor Bennet to her room, curious. I didn't poison him. It's a side effect of the blood herb, it will dissipate in 3 days, Eleanor Bennet smiled, taking a sip of tea. Oh? Daniel Moore looked at Eleanor Bennet with admiration, realizing she had anticipated David King's treachery. Daniel, I'll head back now. Meet me outside Yen Hung Inn at dusk tomorrow, Eleanor Bennet said, standing up to leave. Eleanor Bennet, are you planning to go to Yen Hung Inn? Daniel asked, surprised, knowing it was a brothel and not suitable for a young lady. Daniel, I'll need your help again tomorrow, Eleanor Bennet said softly, moving closer and whispering something in his ear. This. Daniel's fair face turned red immediately. Daniel, it's just a temporary strategy, Eleanor Bennet reassured him, understanding his embarrassment. Eleanor Bennet, when it comes to your matters, I would face any challenge without hesitation. Daniel Moore grasped Eleanor Bennet's soft hand, his feelings growing even stronger. Eleanor Bennet quickly left Harmony Hall and returned to the tailor shop. The attendant immediately recognized her and promptly handed her the clothes. Eleanor Bennet swiftly changed, took the newly purchased dress, and casually walked outside. She glanced back briefly, wondering if the eyes behind her were still watching. Eleanor Bennet smiled smugly and hired a carriage to return to the Bennet residence. Clara Young sighed in relief upon seeing Eleanor Bennet return. Clara Young, see if there's a dress you like. Eleanor Bennet placed the dresses on the round table and sat in a chair to drink tea. Miss, did you go to buy dresses? Clara Young looked at the colorful silk dresses, her eyes filled with joy. Yes. Take whichever you like. Eleanor Bennet leaned against a soft pillow, contemplating the events of the next evening. Tomorrow night was crucial, and she still had no plan. Among the two groups that night, one was clearly helping them. Whose people were they? Could it be David King? If it really was him, it was clear he had seen through her plan entirely. He hadn't revealed it, perhaps because he wanted to outsmart her. Unknowingly, she had become the prey in his trap. She pondered whether to take the ledgers from Y Hunt Institute or not. Without them, she couldn't hold David King accountable. But she really didn't want to harm anyone, so she decided to take a risk. If David King was indeed secretly helping them, at least temporarily, she wouldn't be in mortal danger. Of course, the prerequisite was that the ledger had to be in her possession. In the Palace of Scenic Blossoms, the sound of the zither intertwined with the melodious notes of the jade flute, resembling a spring river. In the main hall, a woman in a red dress with a veil gracefully danced to the gentle rhythm. Her movements were light and elegant. Her soft hands and skin as white as jade appeared even more translucent under the blue glow of the water. Her jet black hair was styled in a cloud bun, adorned with a jeweled hairpin. Her long, delicate eyebrows were like a painting, and her eyes sparkled like stars. Her small nose was complemented by thin lips, the corners slightly upturned with a playful smile. Edward King leaned back in his chair, gazing affectionately at the beauty before him, a slight smile on his lips. When the dance ended, the musicians quickly withdrew. "Your Highness!" The beauty leapt into Edward King's embrace, playfully. "Oh?" Edward King effortlessly lifted her onto his lap. The beauty wrapped her delicate arms around his neck. "Your Highness, how was my dance?" she asked sweetly. "Naturally, like a celestial being." Edward King inhaled her fragrance, his desire quickly ignited. "Then what will your Highness reward me with?" she teased, pretending to evade his kiss. "How about becoming my concubine?" Edward King whispered playfully into the ear of the beauty in his arms. "Thank you, your Highness." At this moment, the thin silk on the beauty had almost fallen, revealing a perfect figure wrapped in a smoky blue corset. She was surprised at how quickly she became a concubine, feeling pleased as she thought about Lady Tanner, who was previously favored. It seemed that becoming the main consort of King Edward was just a matter of time. Edward King sensed her thoughts. To him, the women in the palace were merely entertainments. He already had someone in mind for the position of main consort. Thinking of Eleanor Bennet, his desire surged uncontrollably. Edward King pressed the woman beneath him, but his eyes no longer held any tenderness. "Your Highness, Prince David says he has urgent matters to discuss." Stuart Tree called from outside the screen, having already sensed the sweet aroma inside but had no choice but to interrupt. Hearing it was Edward King, he immediately got up, donned a silk robe, and left the bed. "Your Highness." The beauty, suddenly neglected, sat on the bed with disheveled clothes, pouting. "Sammy, return first." Edward King's voice was cold, devoid of the affection he previously showed. He walked out without a backward glance at the beauty inside. Edward King sat on the grand chair in the main hall, sipping tea, his eyes still filled with unspent desire. He realized that tonight he had certainly disrupted something important. "Third brother." Edward King stood up to greet him. "Fourth brother, what brings you here so late?" Edward King asked, displeased. "Third brother," the spy following Eleanor Bennet reported that David King took her to Charles Manor in the eastern city. "You mean ninth brother took Eleanor Bennet to Charles Manor?" Edward King's already dark face showed signs of anger. "Yes," Edward King replied. Edward King, sitting in the main seat, pondered ninth brother's intentions. Why did he take Eleanor Bennet to the new manor? Could he also be interested in her? When ninth brother took Eleanor Bennet to tour the new manor, she seemed to have angered him. In his fury, he ordered his men to return her to the Bennet residence. Due to the distance, Simone couldn't hear their conversation. After returning, Eleanor Bennet invited the Imperial Medical Institute to request sick leave. However, yesterday, she went out alone, strolling through the streets. She spent about 2 hours in a tailor shop before returning to the Bennet residence. Edward King recounted everything, occasionally observing Edward King's expression. Was she in a clothing store for 2 whole hours? Edward King asked with some doubt, wondering if that was an unusually long time. Yeah, she was probably shopping for clothes. She did leave with quite a few things, James King replied. Third brother, it seems like the relationship between Eleanor Bennet and the ninth brother is very strange. I feel like Eleanor Bennet both hates and fears the ninth brother, James King said, aware that Edward King harbored jealousy over what he had witnessed at the Radiant Sun Gate that day. However, James always felt that Eleanor Bennet and the ninth brother were far from harmonious, despite appearances. The ninth fox is a cunning man. Eleanor Bennet is probably being controlled by him. Edward King reasoned. Given Charles King's arrogant, deceitful, and scheming nature, he was certainly not the type of man Eleanor Bennet would willingly like. The only explanation was that she was being coerced by him. Fourth brother, send someone to keep monitoring Eleanor Bennet. It would be best if we could find out exactly what the ninth brother is using to threaten the Bennet family. Edward King decided to dig into the matter thoroughly, not for the Bennet family, but for Eleanor Bennet. He had been at odds with the ninth brother for years, their battles always ending in a stalemate. To lose now, because of a woman, was unacceptable to him. Moreover, this woman, no matter what, he had to have her. James King accepted the order, but he couldn't help feeling uneasy. Eleanor Bennet had completely become the third brother's weakness. He feared the ninth brother had already realized this and was using it to disrupt Edward King's mind. Since ancient times, beautiful women had been the cause of chaos, and Eleanor Bennet truly lived up to that reputation. Edward King watched James King's figure disappear into the distance, his mind consumed by thoughts of Eleanor Bennet. How could he make her his? With her current status, the only way might be to have the emperor decree a marriage. But for the emperor to issue such an order, Edward needed a solid excuse, and the missing ledger tied to David King was the perfect opportunity for him to shine once again in court. Who's there? Edward King suddenly heard a faint sound behind the screen and asked sharply. Everyone in his residence knew his rules. Anyone caught eavesdropping on his conversations would face only one punishment. Edward King swung his hand, knocking over the screen, and there he saw Wukong trembling in fear, kneeling on the ground. Didn't I tell you to leave? Edward King narrowed his eyes, his inner energy already surging within him. My lord, I dare not do it again. Wukong had been unwilling to leave in failure tonight, so she had stayed behind in hopes of gaining Edward King's favor once more. Unexpectedly, she overheard the conversation about another woman. Jealousy flared, and she hid behind the screen to listen more closely. Wukong, you know I despise women who think they're clever, even more so those who don't obey. Edward King grabbed her delicate chin, his gaze filled with killing intent. My lord, I won't do it again. Wukong pleaded fearfully. The man who had been tender earlier had now transformed into someone cold and ruthless, making her feel as if she had entered a foreign, terrifying world. Wukong, don't blame me. Edward King tightened his grip around her slender neck. Wukong panicked, and before long, her breath ceased. Her life extinguished. Edward King coldly tossed her aside and stepped into the inner chamber. Eunuch Liam quickly arrived with several servants to clean up the scene, restoring everything to its usual tranquil state. "Stand up, all of you." Charles King gently stroked the gemstone ring on his finger, his expression unreadable. "Sect Master, the remnants of the Seven Kills sect have been completely eliminated, but—" Shadow hesitated, his face showing a hint of terror. "But what?" Charles King raised his head, his gaze icy cold. "The sect master of the Seven Kills sect has escaped, and their whereabouts are unknown. I beg for your punishment, my lord." Shadow knelt down, knowing he could not escape blame. Charles King remained silent for a moment. "My lord, David King has been arranged by Daniel Moore to stay at Harmony Hall. Furthermore, Eleanor Bennett has already met David King and likely knows the whereabouts of the ledger," Blood Shadow reported. "Oh? Have those who were tracking her been dealt with?" Charles King seemed indifferent to Shadow kneeling on the ground. "Lady Bennett is very clever. She disguised herself and evaded her pursuers, sparing us quite a bit of trouble." Blood Shadow's voice carried a tone of admiration. Hearing this, Charles King unexpectedly let out a faint smile, which was quickly noticed by the four sect masters present. They had never seen their leader smile before, and witnessing it today left them utterly astonished. Apart from Blood Shadow, the other three were deeply curious about Eleanor Bennett, wondering what kind of person she was to possess such charm. "Shadow, stand up. We'll deal with your matter later," Charles King declared, seemingly not intending to punish Shadow. From today onward, the Cold Shadow sect must focus all efforts on finding the ledger. "If anyone shows negligence, I will show no mercy," Charles King commanded coldly as he stood. "Illusion, Dark Shadow, you are to monitor Eleanor Bennett and Daniel Moore closely. Do not alert them under any circumstances. Blood Shadow, Shadow, follow me. All other branches are to remain on standby." With that, Charles King left the Grand Hall, and everyone knelt in unison to pay their respects. Blood Shadow and Shadow immediately followed. Under the cold moonlight, their figures quickly disappeared into the distance. The moon that night shone faintly, as if harboring untold secrets. Early the next morning, Eleanor Bennett rose at dawn. After quickly freshening up and having breakfast, she sat down at her desk to write a letter to Daniel Moore. She had thought it over all night and decided that Daniel Moore should not make an appearance at Fragrant Orchid House. Daniel Moore, being somewhat well known in the capital, had a face too easily recognized, which could attract unnecessary attention. Moreover, she was wary of David King turning against them. Though he was now disgraced and ruined, there was no guarantee that all remnants of his faction had been eradicated. Daniel needed to remain at Harmony Hall to keep an eye on him until she secured the ledger. Eleanor carefully sealed the letter in an envelope and instructed Clara Young to deliver it to Harmony Hall. She then began planning her trip to Fragrant Orchid House that evening. As the hour of Shin approached, Eleanor Bennett prepared her male disguise. Taking a small porcelain bottle from the medicine chest, she smiled and tucked it into her sleeve. Everything was firmly within her grasp. "Clara Young, tell the steward to prepare a sedan chair. I want to go out." Eleanor Bennett instructed Clara Young, who was waiting outside the door. "Miss, you're heading out at this hour?" Clara Young asked, glancing at the late sky. "Just hurry and make the preparations, stop asking so many questions." Eleanor Bennett replied impatiently, ignoring her further. Clara Young noticed Eleanor Bennett was unhappy and quickly went to prepare. After all, her lady was someone of status, and she truly dared not offend her. Eleanor Bennet arrived at the mansion's gate and saw the carriage waiting. She got in and instructed Clara Young to go to the tailor shop she had visited yesterday. Clara Young dared not ask much. The lady wanted to buy clothes again. Eleanor Bennet sat in the carriage, watching as the street shops began to have fewer customers, most likely preparing to close soon. Her gaze stopped at a jewelry store sign, and she immediately told Clara Young to stop the carriage. "Miss, why are we stopping?" Clara Young helped Eleanor Bennet out of the carriage and asked. "Let's check out the jewelry first." Eleanor Bennet smiled slightly and walked straight into the jewelry store. The shop owner, seeing Eleanor Bennet enter, quickly greeted her with a smile. It was unexpected to have a customer at this hour. "What would you like to buy, miss?" The shop owner stood before Eleanor Bennet, presenting several gold and pearl jewelry pieces for her to choose from. Eleanor Bennet glanced at a few items, paid without hesitation, and left the store. Clara Young followed curiously, thinking that today the lady was shopping unusually quickly, not even asking for prices. Eleanor Bennet got back in the carriage and instructed Clara Young to continue to the tailor shop. When passing a bakery, she asked Clara Young to buy some pastries. Thus, stopping and going, it was nearly the hour of the rooster before they reached the tailor shop. At this time, the shop was still open, though there were not many customers inside. Chapter 35, He Still Saved Her. February 3rd, Eleanor Bennet entered the shop, and the assistant immediately recognized her, warmly welcoming her. "Miss, what kind of clothing would you like to choose today?" Eleanor Bennet glanced over a few cloaks, then looked at some light-colored outfits, selecting an outfit and a cloak, and handed them to Clara Young. "Clara Young, try them on for me," Eleanor Bennet said with a smile as she saw Clara Young's surprised expression. "Miss?" Clara Young's eyes widened in surprise. "Go on." Eleanor Bennet used a slightly commanding tone, prompting Clara Young to quickly step into the fitting room. In no time, she emerged. Eleanor Bennet, satisfied with Clara Young's new appearance, nodded in approval. "Assistant, I'll take this outfit." Eleanor Bennet handed a silver ingot to the assistant. "Clara Young, come here." Eleanor Bennet called Clara Young over and whispered a few words. "Miss, this matter. You must listen to me. Otherwise, I'll expel you from the Bennet residence." Eleanor Bennet's cold expression left Clara Young speechless. Eleanor Bennet adjusted Clara Young's cloak and let her get in the carriage to leave the tailor shop. The shop assistant glanced at Eleanor Bennet, seemingly understanding something. Could it be a matter of using backdoor connections? "Shop assistant, shouldn't you be closing the shop now?" Eleanor Bennet sneered coldly, looking at the bewildered shop assistant as she spoke. "Yes, my lady, I'll close it immediately." Eleanor Bennet cast a brief glance at the shop assistant before heading into the fitting room herself. She changed into a set of men's clothing and draped a black cloak over her shoulders, perfectly concealing her radiant, handsome features. "My lady, allow me to escort you to the back door." By this time, the shop assistant had already closed the shop and led her inside. "All right, thank you. This is for you." Eleanor Bennet smiled and handed him a silver ingot. Overjoyed, the shop assistant accepted the reward. Eleanor Bennet slipped out through the back door and hired another sedan chair. Her destination, the grandest brothel in the capital, Deesyang Courtyard. This place was a haven for poets, scholars, and noble officials, a luxurious and mesmerizing locale where money flowed like water. Sitting inside the sedan chair, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel a bit excited. I wonder what the ancient world's pleasure quarters will be like. Surely, they must be more elegant than modern massage parlors, right? After all, the women here don't rely solely on their beauty, their talents and skills are what truly enhance their value. Young master, we've arrived. The sedan chair stopped in front of a bustling area. Eleanor Bennet peeked through the curtain and saw a majestic, four-story ancient building illuminated by dazzling lights. Outside, a few women dressed flamboyantly were enticing customers. Eleanor Bennet stepped out of the sedan chair and noticed the signboard with the words, Deesyang Courtyard, surrounded by painted plum and orchid branches. She couldn't help but sneer, using such pure and elegant symbols to adorn a filthy, debauched place like this, truly a disgrace to the nobility of plum and orchid. After paying for the sedan chair, she made her way to the grand entrance. At this moment, several heavily made-up women approached, greeting her warmly. "Young master, you look unfamiliar.